Hello everyone, this is Bradley. Today this is a tutorial for this tearing gate effect I saw from a game. This effect should be quite straightforward, so let's start. So here we are in Blender, and this is the node tree from the last tutorial talking about the tearing cloth transition. You do not need to worry about this node tree if you haven't watched the tutorial in the past. We're going to start from scratch. But I just want to mention that this is a very important reference for me to start to tackle the question of this entire tearing gate animation. There are many different techniques used in this effect, but many other techniques have been solved in the past, and you can find the relevant tutorials in, for example, deepening transition effect, the tornado effect, and fiery fissures, and so on. And in this case, we are just combining all the techniques used or taught in the past to a new one. And this is very important lesson that you should not just learn a particular effect, but learn the techniques behind that and try to utilize that in some other animation. And it's very unrealistic for me to make a tutorial for every variation of the same technique. I do not have time, and I'm not obligated to make all these kind of tutorials. That's why, if possible, sometimes I make a recording without a voice, and then I post that. If you would like to learn the technique, you can find old tutorials and reference. But if I do not have time, then a recording without a voice is everything I can provide. Anyway, so let's start from scratch for this effect. As always, I'm going to use the presets, which you can download for free from the link in the description. Let's start from scratch. I'm going to create a new node tree and name that as a tutorial, and delete everything. We're going to start the entire concept with the zipping transition animation in the past. So we need to have a guidance curve. So let's create a path because it's just a straight line. And we can import this nervous path into the node tree. And now I can hide that. And inside the node tree, we are visualizing this curve. We need to turn on this relative, so it's showing the correct orientation we want. And in the deepening transition effect, we're using these helical connections. Helical connections. Yes, which is essentially just splitting one curve into multiple parts. And in this case, I'm just using 2. So we are using a single radius to control this splitting distance. And this is kind of very important, where you can put a spline parameter to control this radius. So you have one part not being split and the other part is split apart. Okay. We can also float curve to remap this entire relationship to 0, 1, 0, so that you have attaching 2 ends, but the middle part is being splitted. Okay, these 2 curves are very important because we need to generate a face in the middle, and we also need to generate the extra face on the side as well in this case. We're going to use 2 different methods for each type of face, and let's firstly do a bevel curve, which is basically just a curve to mesh operation. And in this case, we are using a round profile, making that kind of a tube-like structure. This is not what I want, but if I turn on the flat profile and turn on this radius, then because my default flat profile is centered, so it's occupying the center location, which I do not want it to happen. In this case, we just need to have a curve linear. And we turn off this centered portion, so that the profile always go beyond the initial curve without occupying the center. But we have another different one which is occupying the center. And in this case, what we need to do is basically just to flip that set curve radius, set curve code, yes. And if we flip by 180 degrees, then you can see it goes to the opposite side. But we need to only flip one of them. And then fortunately, I have a spline index so that you can see one is the black spline or black curve, which is 0, and the other is a white curve, which means 1. And the 0 means no, and 1 means yes. You can directly plug that into the selection as a kind of quick cheat. And obviously, it's not working. We need to reverse this Boolean relationship so that they're going out. Okay. And now we can go to the camera and visualize what we are dealing with. Here, you might want to ask, why is this important? Because we need to have texture and the materials to make a kind of flame-like edges on the other parts. So here, let's take a store UV map. Set material. And I need a new material. Just name that as a kind of a side flame, whatever. And I think this is fine. Let's go to the shader very quickly. This is going to be a kind of very simple texture, just like the flame trail we are making these days. Take an attribute node, and we have UV map attribute being imported. This UV map is going to guide our noise texture coordinate. I'm going to only use the factor. Let's color ramp that to increase the contrast so that we can visualize it a little bit better. I'm going to change the coordinate to make it more flame-like. Take a vector mass multiply. And let's increase the X, decrease the Y, so that this looks like kind of a flame, but we are going to fade out the destination of this entire texture. So we are going to use the UV map characteristic. That's on the y-axis, we have 0 on one side and 1 on the other side. We just multiply that. Let's multiply. Multiply them together. And then we have this effect. Actually, we should go the opposite direction. So let's just use a remap 0 to 1. I have a reverse. This is essentially just a map range. But obviously, we do not have a reverse, so you have to type in whatever stuff instead of hitting a button, which is giving you what you want immediately. And in this case, let's just increase a little bit of contrast again. Okay, and you can tweak these parameters definitely. And let's only extract the alpha, so emissive alpha BSDF. Plug into the alpha. This is very noisy in eevee, so we are going to use the blended render mode. So we remove the noise, and you can play around with the settings. Especially you can animate that using the add mask. And in this case, we just animate on the y-axis. Yes, this is very nice, like a kind of flame. I'm going to take a component XYZ and take a time info to drive the animation of that. If I play the animation, let's take that into the negative. So now it goes the opposite direction. Of course, you can also add some sine wave to this whatever stuff, but basically this is going to be it. You can give it a color using the color ramp as well. I've shown the coloring in the past, but in this case, I can show this again. It's essentially just adding all these kind of different markers. For example, I have a red, I have an orange, or yellow, whatever. Probably let's go to the other side. So sometimes it's not very prominent. You can either turn on the alpha or just increase the emission strength. And let's turn on the bloom using the compositor. In compositing, use nodes, and I have a glare node, which is giving the bloom function. You can tweak all these parameters, but I think this should be fine. We increase the strength, and it's not a very saturated because of AGX view transform. So we change that to standard. It will be kind of very saturated lights, which is kind of glowing out, whatever. And it's something that you can tweak by yourself, but basically this is the animation on the side. And we need to fix something in the center. To make up the center face is quite straightforward, but there are multiple approaches available. So it can be a little bit tricky which method to use. One way is that imagine we have these two curves, and what we are trying to do is essentially just connecting curve to curve from points to points and to make up a face. And recently I've just made a tutorial talking about this concept, which is love the curves, in which we're using this technique to make up the blade trail. And this preset is kind of very easy by principle. And you can watch the older tutorial talking about how easy it is. It's just about 8 nodes in total. And we have a UV map, which is very nice. The downside of it is that since we are only really connecting curves together, we do not have a kind of subdivision on the other axis because we only start with 2 curves. I can improve these presets, make it more complicated, but it was not implemented yet. On the other hand, I simply didn't use this method at all. I was using another method which you are very familiar with because we just use that. We have this bevel curve. And we use this bevel curve to generate a face on the side. But in this case, if I use this center face, then I'm generating face in the middle. But I need to interpolate that to fit our general structure. And in this case, we again have this kind of radius which fit in. So we have set curve radius. Ta-da! Then we fix this issue. We have the resolution in the center from our flat profile, which can increase the subdivision very nicely, so that we have this kind of nice square-like polygons to play around later. This is a beauty of a procedural setup, so that you just change one parameters and you will affect the both sides very nicely. This is completely procedural, which is beautiful, amazing. And you can animate this radius as well. If you take a remap 0 to 1, and you can increase that so that you have different 2 kinds of effects. You can open up this gate with your parameters. Okay, this is kind of very nice. But in this case, we again need to store UV map and set a different material for the center. And this time, this material can be just an emission shader. And I'm just going to give it kind of emission color, maybe red, whatever. As we finish this center part, we can start to do our cross tiering transition effect I've taught earlier. And just a little bit reminder or giving you kind of idea about what I've discussed in the last tutorial. It's basically to have a grid, and we're using a noise texture to delete the geometry. And by comparing less than, I'm giving this kind of stretching like tiering effect for our polygons. Okay, but it's more kind of illusion. We're essentially just deleting geometry. And if you have watched the previous tutorial and finished that, you can really just copy paste this entire node tree. It's a procedural. Okay, but anyway, we are going to start over again. And so So here, let's add a delete geometry to our center geometry. And I can take a noise texture. We need to have the UV map for mapping and plug in the factor into the delete geometry. Let's take a left scan. And now we get a kind of a preliminary effect by deleting these points. Actually, it should be face. Yes, we get a simple effect by deleting these polygons. It's very ugly because we do not have enough subdivision. Let's subdivide the mesh, maybe several times. But because we subdivide the mesh and the point count does not fit, we need to capture attribute and plug in the UV map, plug into the vector, and we will have some weird artifact as well because the UV map is face corner. Now this is fine. We fix this texture. Let's map that more correctly. Let's take a vector mass and let's stretch our UV map. Should be, yes, decreasing y and increasing x. So now we have this effect. And we can smooth it out, smooth position to make it more kind of organic. And one kind of very important part in the previous tutorial is that we're trying to make the edges intact. So instead of like it's kind of splitting every patches and having all this kind of island floating in the middle. So to create a kind of a gradient on two sides, we still do the same magic with our separate X, Y, Z. And you can see on the y-axis, we're going to color ramp that to white, black, white. And we add that to the noise texture. And we can take a float curve to map the interpolation of this function so that you can see this tearing effect. It's like this. Okay. And the rest is about tweaking these kind of parameters. For example, increase the X or Y, make it more kind of whatever. Okay. But this is probably yet. And previously we have this parameter which controls the opening of this entire gate. Here we can just put that into a grouping part so that we have a parameter to control it. We have the grouping part. And I use this maximum to control it. Let's just name that as a factor. And we can have this factor to control this opening of the gate and the tearing of this gate at the same time. You can try to make a float curve as well to make it tear a little bit later in this process, and probably make it sharper. Yes, something like that. It depends on how you keyframe this animation, but anyway. But then we have this effect, and you can. The rest is about essentially the tweaking of these kind of parameters. For example, turn on the bloom, and we can tweak these shaders as well. The rest is basically about polishing this effect. For example, you will realize that these two textures are basically mirroring each other because they are using the same coordinate system and the noise texture parameters. Here, we are going to distinguish two sides using the spline index again. And I'm going to change that to integer and using a W to name it. You can name whatever you want, but anyway. And here I'm just going to import this W attribute and to change the coordinates of our noise texture so that you see it becomes different. Okay. Another thing I can potentially do is to add a color ramp. And I need to reverse the relationship to have a kind of a ring. And by adding it to the original texture, you can basically trying to delete this sharp cutting edges in the middle of two regions. Okay. Here I also want to add some irregularity or noise to this texture because this is too regular. So I'm going to add some noise texture to this coordinate. And I have presets like noise displacement and vector noise. So I can plug that in, and you can use the same coordinates, or you can duplicate another one. Here, I probably will just duplicate another one and plug that in. So now if I visualize the final product and tweak the parameters, you can just add more parameters, increase or decrease it. And you play this animation, you get a kind of different layers of this effect. Okay. One more thing I want to remind you is that currently we're using a single parameter to control this factor of gate opening and tiering. But you can also try with other methods of tiering. For example, you can take a proximity for so that by increasing this scale, you're basically masking the center region of this entire mesh, and you're trying to removing this center region. And by increasing this scale, you're trying to tearing everything apart. So basically what you're doing is to have a kind of gradient to tear from the center. And you can try to play around with whatever this stuff. There are many different possibilities of this effect, but due to time limitation, I can only show this many of yet, as I'm getting tired as well. The last tip I want to mention is that right now we're working in the same node tree because I want to maximize the proceduralism of this setup to use one parameter control whatever other stuff. But when you are rendering an animation or compositing an animation, you probably want to separate them into different layers. In this case, what I usually do in my project is to actually use a menu switch so that I can try to output different parts in different geometry or different object. So that we have a side and we have a center. And I can put them into different view layer. Right now, I'm only rendering side with the plane, but I have this plane 002 to render the center. And you can duplicate the view layer so that to only render the center if you want. And you have another view layer to only render the side as you want. But the parameter will unlink each other. So in this case, you can really just copy paste the driver, copy as new driver, and paste as new driver. Or you can simply just to delete this entire group input. So if you want to link the parameter across the node tree, then you just keep them inside the node tree, or you just use a driver to link it. Or if you want to have a different value for each object, for example, you can have a different side, then you just put these parameters into the group input. And probably I can transform it as well and put another group input. And this is just an example that I can just move that on a different axis. And I can change the parameters of that so that I have different layers of it. You can use this kind of concept in compositing, and this is how I usually composite. So There are so many things I cannot teach you due to the limited time and energy, but I hope you can learn something. And I think the problem solving skill in this tutorial is much more important than this effect itself. So I hope you enjoy this video. I'll probably see you next time. Bye bye.